and good afternoon. It's wonderful to be back here, hopefully a bit refreshed. And I want to thank Ravi and LASSI for inviting me and to Good Shepherd School. Of course, it's such a wonderful, idyllic setup in which to discuss liberal education. I think liberal education comes alive when we live the life, and obviously we can see people living the life here. I mean, my interest in liberal arts education goes back to the time when I was teaching at Stanford. And there was a very interesting request came from the computer science department there. And it came to the English department and to the music department. And they asked us, can you create a dual major, two dual major programs? One dual major would be computer science and music, and the other would be computer science and literature. And it was very interesting that the request actually came from the computer science department, which, as some of you know, essentially created Silicon Valley. And it's very interesting. Silicon Valley is a very bizarre place. I lived there in Palo Alto from 2007 to 2016. I remember Facebook was this little office in 156 University Avenue. Sometimes in the farmer's market, we'll see this hoodie-clad figure, Mark Zuckerberg, picking up fruits. So it was a very bizarre thing. All these kind of virtual things were actually real. But as I looked around, I realized why they wanted this. We still remember the time of Napster and other things. And then there's an embedded interest in computer scientists in music and literature. And then, I realized that this is part of Silicon Valley culture. And of course, Silicon Valley is a very problematic place. I think 2010, we saw the movie Social Network. And in 2020, of course, we saw The Social Dilemma. And between 10 years, we've seen Silicon Valley can be very exclusive. It can be very sexist. There are racial problems. But at the same time, I felt it's the last frontier of genuine innovation in America, the Western frontier, literally. And as I looked around, and it's a place, if you sit in the coffee houses, you always hear somebody being interviewed for Facebook or Google or something. And then you realize that Silicon Valley, the startups are not just a product of engineering. They are a product of engineering, sciences, design, art, language, psychology. In other words, they are actually a very cutting-edge, new version of something very old, and that is liberal arts, very ancient and very interdisciplinary. And what I mean by that, I think there's a lot of confusion. I think today morning we've heard a lot of air clearing, that what the confusion is, and I want to get to the root of the term. And therefore I have this term PhD, the Doctor of Philosophy. And it's a bit like philosophy in Doctor of Philosophy. We get a Doctor of Philosophy in philosophy, we get it in music, we get it in mathematics, we get it in literature, we get it in all subjects. So what is going on? So obviously here philosophy is in its original Greek sense. Philos plus sophia, love for knowledge. It is not, so it's in the new sense philosophy is a subject, but in its ancient sense it's essentially all subjects. Remember, if you think of the Greek philosophers, it's very easy for them to talk about, medicine one moment and then suddenly move to poetry and then suddenly talk about politics. That's what Aristotle is. And that's how it went on for the longest time. It's really around the European Enlightenment of the 18th century that, the new disciplines were coming up, the sciences were coming up, the social sciences were coming up. And even if you think of that pioneering text which changed science, Newton's Principles of Natural Philosophy, Newton is not using the word science. Why? The word science didn't exist. The word science simply didn't exist at the time. It was called natural philosophy. So philosophy of nature as opposed to human philosophy. Of course, as the subject started getting developed, people felt that this is too vague a term, this is too large, it's too baggy. We need to have something a little more specific. And that's when in 1830s, the British Association of the Study of Scientists, they said that we need a term, there's a wonderful term for people who practice arts, artist. So let's have a term for people who do science. Scientist. So the word scientist was actually coined based on the word artist, which as someone in the arts, it gives me great joy. That's how interesting is that. So I think what the point is, these terms have very strange histories. And liberal arts simply comes from a time when there was no word for science. Everything was the art. Everything was the art. So it's actually, and then if you go back, and we've talked a bit about this today, it's like, there is obviously the medieval university had the 4 scientific arts. It's very interesting. The quadrivium was the 4 scientific arts. And the scientific arts are very interestingly arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Music is a scientific art, which is really fascinating. And this, actually, there's some very interesting, even recent experiences. I was a consultant for the liberal arts for the New Education Policy Committee. And the greatest support for humanistic education actually came in the committee from 2 scientists. One was Kasturi Rangan, who's a physicist, as some of you know. And the other person was this very interesting young mathematician from Princeton, Manjul Bhargav. So I had many conversations with him. And this is something Manjul has said even in public, that he was a tabla player. He was actually a tabla player, and he had this interest in Indian classical music, which really helped him understand mathematics at a very high level. So clearly it was quite fascinating that how these scientific arts were part of the quadrivium. And then you had these 3 humanistic arts, which are obviously, you have grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So what we have here, the main reason, the confusion behind the term liberal arts is that it's an anachronism. It's an anachronism from a time when all subjects were arts. And what is an anachronism really? An anachronism in my mind is like a lovely antique chair. I mean, do you want to throw away all your lovely antique chairs and get them replaced with very technologically fascinated things? Maybe not. That's, I think, why we have retained the term liberal arts even today. Though I think it does create some confusion. So in some ways, the term liberal arts science is quite useful. So what is the term really? And here's I have a quote from Cardinal Newman. You can take the time to read it, and you can see that he's talking about education as an end in itself. But the main distinction, we have to move away from the word arts to the word liberal. And the word liberal is to be understood in contrast to the word professional. So there's only one defining criteria for the word liberal, that which is not tied to an immediate vocation. Anything which is not tied to an immediate vocation, but is an examination of a foundational subject, is liberal. And this is something which was a subject of debate, much debate in philosophy. One of the founding figures in this field is Immanuel Kant, who has this really interesting treatise called Conflict of the Faculties. And Kant says that, there are the higher faculties and the lower faculties. Now, what are the higher faculties? The higher faculties for Kant are law, medicine, and clergy. Clergy, of course, and these are the professional schools of the time. These are the professional schools. Obviously, today, if Kant was writing, he might have replaced the clergy with the business school. Business schools didn't exist at the time, but the clergy was the professional class. And it's fascinating that Kant calls them higher faculty, not in the sense they're superior, but he says the lower faculty is essentially the philosophy faculty. And what that means is that it's essentially the entire faculty of arts and sciences. And Kant even goes on to say that, the higher faculty are subject to some restrictions. You cannot practice law. Law is not really about the rule of God. It's about the rule of human beings. You can't really practice medicine. It's not really about anatomy. It's really about you have to be licensed. So you're subject to certain rules. Whereas the philosophy faculty is where you're completely free. It's about the free play of reason. You can explore anything. Because obviously you're not getting licensed to kill or fight for anybody. So what I like to say is, what is important to remember, I like to say this. So biology is a liberal art. Medicine is not a liberal art. In the same way, political science is a liberal art. Law is not a liberal art. Economics is a liberal art. Accountancy is not a liberal art. English is a liberal art, but journalism is not a liberal art. So clearly the whole distinction has really nothing to do with the sciences and the arts. That is the main misconception that we need to clear up. It has a lot to do with what can be applied to a certain career versus what is generally just exploration for the discipline for its own sake. Now, the fact is, more of the humanities are likely to be foundational. More of the sciences are likely to be applied. That's a different thing. But in generally, and this is the foundation from which we move to Kant. One of Kant's disciples was Wilhelm von Humboldt, who, as some of you know, made the modern research university. The Free University of Berlin was the first university where, the university was understood as a place where you go to learn things. But Humboldt said, no, that's not enough. Universities are not just about learning. Universities are also about creation of knowledge. You must go to create new knowledge. So the whole modern university as a place which research, teaching and professional training comes together, that was created by Humboldt, who was influenced by Kant. And the first American university which put this in practice is Johns Hopkins in the US. And from there, it spread to the other Ivy Leagues at the time. And if you go to any university, you see an interesting architecture. So when at Stanford, we had this quad. The quad is this big circular building where we had English, history, mathematics, physics, psychology, all these sort of buildings. And then far away, we had the School of Engineering. We had the business school. We had the medical school, we had the law school. Of course, you can see from the architecture that the early mission of the university is about the foundational subjects, and the professional schools come later. Of course, the fact is professional schools also need much more space, and they're much more expensive affairs, so they are often a little far away. And that's a feature you see in many universities. The central part of the university is occupied by the core liberal arts and sciences, whereas the far away is the professional schools. The School of Education is also one of them. And that is something which made me think that, do we have a liberal arts system in India? Do we have a liberal arts education? This was the time when I was about to come back to India to help set up Ashoka University, and I was thinking that, is it possible? Do we have a similar system of liberal arts and science education? And that's when I ended up writing this book, College Pathways of Possibilities, where I try to sort of lay out the possibility of, what do we have? Do we have the liberal arts science education? So what I'll do is, to give an example of what I think I saw existing in India, I'll just read just two brief passages from here, and I'll say why it's a very different scene. So we English literature students, I was talking about College Street, which is a very interesting place in Calcutta where all the bookshops are there. But of late I saw all the bookshops were gone, and it was full of all these sort of kind of planners for GRE, GMAT, joint entrance. It's full of these question papers. I'm like, what's happening? There's something about the landscape of College Street that is changing. Probably Delhi's Daryaganj has seen the same kind of thing, that the books are gone. We have all the manuals, the question banks. And then I realized there's a history behind it. So we English literature students bought our volumes of Keats and Byron in College Street. We also made pilgrimages there in search of books of a less poetic nature. Bundles of University Calcutta exam scripts. So we used to also go there to look for these exam scripts, question banks. This was because our entire undergraduate grades depended on how well we did in a series of 3-hour examinations held over a couple of 2-week periods during the 3-year course. If your college wasn't particular about attendance, you could be fishing in Alaska for the rest of the time, or for that matter, hold down a full-time job in Mumbai. No one cared. Or you have to show up in exams and pass. So the life-saving skill was the academic ability to second-guess the examiners. Would that question on Joseph Conrad's prose style show up this year? What about the question on symbolism in Yeats? It was wise to discount the questions that had been said the previous year, and we were assured that authorities did not like to repeat questions in successive years. So it's all a kind of a game. I'm trying to game and outpace the examiner. What questions are going to come this year? So questions from odd and even numbered years did not mingle in the same question set. Since our English BA Part 1 was to be held in an odd numbered year, I zealously prepared the answer to a question on the tragic structure of James Singh's Riders to the Sea that had first appeared with the exact same wording in an odd numbered year from British ruled India. I'm not making this up. This question had been coming for more than 50 years, just appearing at a regular interval. It's quite fascinating how things remain unchanged. So no wonder people spend so much time just guessing what is the question for this year. Many college students in India today will still have no trouble recognizing the picture, and if this mechanical approach seems particularly ironical with a subject like English literature, it is not much of a surprise given the history of the modern Indian university, in which I'll come in a moment. So clearly, on one hand, we have a system which is very bureaucratic, which is very exam-driven, and therefore there's not much of a learning. It's about gaming the questions. And on the other hand, we have another picture which is equally distressing. Let's swing to a different scene in this city of Kota in the northwestern state of Rajasthan. This picture comes from an article on quartz.com that went viral in India a couple of years ago. It was a piece of recollection by Alankar Jain, a graduate of the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Bombay. Jain recalls his teenage years that were devoted to the fevered dream of cracking the IIT entrance test that for many unlocked the passage to a platinum future. It's really a long elegy for a life lost in the pursuit of a career dream that once attained turned out to be something for a dampener for him. The most intense years of this psychedelic dream nightmare were spent in Kota, which had gathered the glum reputation of the national capital of private coaching to ace the IIT entrance test. In a dark and clammy rented room in Kota, Jain met a spine-chilling graffiti carved on the wall by previous occupant. I spent my worst years in this room. It's your turn now. It's really scary. He goes into this room and he sees this graffiti. And it's obviously a kind of an excessive picture. It's like it's not all picture is as bad as that. But the point is, I felt when I was coming that Indian higher education is kind of almost polarized between these two extremes. On one hand, you have this very bureaucratic, very exam-driven arts and science model. And on the other hand, you have this very feverish madness about IITs. And then, why is that? There are very clear historical reasons behind it. And one reason is the public universities in India were set up by the British. So 1857 is the crucial year when the three presidencies, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, are the first universities. University of Calcutta, University of Madras, and University of Bombay. And the British did not really try to replicate the Humboldtian model. Their goal was not to create a research university in the manner of Humboldt, nor was their goal to create the kind of pastoral care college in Oxford and Cambridge. Their goal was really to create a system which would certify the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. And that was because they needed people to staff, the clerks and bureaucrats, to staff this large imperial service, without which they could not sort of rule this huge country, which was even bigger, obviously, back then. And what is the way to do it? The quickest way to ensure this is exams. So essentially, the universities were really not centers of learning, but centers for administering exams. And this is not just in India, this is true of many other parts of the British colony, in South Africa, in Caribbean, a very similar model, and this was derived from the University of London model. The University of London model, and it's a cheaper model. To actually have research and teaching in an intense way is much more expensive. But to administer exams is much cheaper. And that was the model that, kind of came into being. And there are also many racist reasons behind it. And there's a wonderful book called Science and the Raj by Deepak Kumar, JNU professor, who says there was a lot of racist beliefs that Indians were not capable of doing real science. He said things like, Indians can be maybe a compounder or a nurse, but they can't really be a doctor or a scientist. A tropical brain doesn't nourish those thoughts. So there's a lot of bias about that. And that made me want to think about this and made me want to write this book, which got me involved in all these liberal arts proceedings at different levels. And it's also very clear that when we talk of education in India, we think of consumption of knowledge. Education in India is a test of how well you consume knowledge, how well you learn, and exams are a place where you're tested how well you've learned it. But the higher education, half the story of higher education is consumption. The other half is production of knowledge. Are we producing knowledge? Are we asking students to create new knowledge? And if you actually look at the Indian higher education landscape, it's very clear the research and teaching are both there, but they're completely bifurcated, but they're really separated. For instance, for the longest time, you had institutes like Asiatic Society, and later institutes like ISI, IIS, Indian Institute of Sciences, Bangalore, TIFR, CSDS Delhi, CSCAL. These are all well-known institutes of research in natural and social sciences, but they're completely separate. These are really for research, maybe some postdoctoral work, maybe a few of them offer PhDs, but it's really a totally different venue, and the colleges are completely separate. The colleges are seen as a place where you teach, where the function of the academic is just to teach, to kind of, teach existing knowledge. Whereas the research university actually brings the two together. Research and teaching are done by the same person, and the students are asked to do the same thing. You learn, but you produce. Princeton, for instance, every single student there has to write a capstone thesis. It doesn't matter what you're studying, whether you're studying science or arts or economics, you have to write a capstone thesis. We simply haven't had this model. We haven't had this model because the higher education landscape separates teaching and research in two completely separate directions. Things have started to change. So if you look at the ISERS, Institute of, I think it's called Institute of Science Education and Research, something like that, or CMI, Chennai Mathematical Institute, there are some new institutes which are actually trying to integrate research into teaching. And that is a very new development. And that is obviously, that's what we also try to do at Ashoka. So the question then becomes, what is the curricular structure? What is the ideal curricular structure of liberal arts education? And what are the human faculties? What are the natural human faculties? And what can we do with it? Basically, what are we born with? And what can education do? Those kind of precious 4 years. And I mean, there's a story I describe in this book, which is actually very personal experience. I was in a flight from Delhi to Bangalore. And there was sometimes it is a common experience you've had. There's a little bit of problem with overhead cabin space. So there was like things were not setting into place. And this gentleman comes along and he says, he just does a beautiful job. He just immediately sort of asks people to step aside. He moves everything and then immediately there's space. And then he says, oh, this is a matter of common sense. And then I started thinking, is it really common sense? Now, is common sense really that common? If common sense were that common, why couldn't we really come up with it? And this incident, along with another person with whom I worked very closely while writing this book, really helped me to make sense of this. This person's name is Howard Gardner. He's a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and some of you might know his theory of multiple intelligence. And I realized, and this is where I think his theories come into place, is that what we call common sense is actually a combination of spatial, bodily, and interpersonal, kind of intelligence. And that is something that really kind of struck me. And I think Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence is very known among school K-12 educationists. It's very fundamental. People who do Waldorf schooling and other methods, they already know that. It's not as commonly applied to higher education. And Howard Gardner's group has been trying to work on this, sort of extend this theory to liberal arts education in the 21st century. And obviously, I think it is known that, he has kind of made IQ, the traditionally understood IQ test, irrelevant, because IQ test is really a test of just, two kinds, logical, mathematical, and linguistic intelligence. So he talks about all these different forms of intelligence. As you can see, it's linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, personal, naturalist, spiritual, moral. And only the first two, the linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence, is the foundation of practically all our academic disciplines. Whereas there's many more. For instance, the architect or the interior designer needs a lot of spatial intelligence. The theater person or the music person needs a lot of bodily intelligence, musical intelligence, of course. Business and leadership needs a lot of personal intelligence. And I think this model of multiple intelligence really captures almost something like the entire human faculty. And the question to think is it possible to have a curriculum that integrates as much of this entire spectrum of human faculty as possible? That is the key thing. And that is where I think we've been talking about this a little bit during our informal discussions, that liberal arts education, the best way to imagine it, traditional education, which was of course the system we have in our colonial universities, is what I call the I-shaped education. An I is vertical, there's kind of depth in a single direction, whereas what we have, what interdisciplinary liberal arts education does is create a T-shaped model. So you can see that in the T, the vertical depth is still there. It's still very important. It's not less important. The vertical bar is still longer than the horizontal bar. But now we have a horizontal bar which kind of shows range. And how do we get this, this range? One way, of course, is something we've already heard, that very first year general education is where you examine a whole range of things: philosophical inquiry, social inquiry, natural, quantitative reasoning. That's one way. But the more exciting way, I think the more exciting way of doing it in the 21st century is what I call the contradisciplinary. This is what, gets us back to the computer science and English dual major. And I think this is the feature of liberal arts education that is going to define the 21st century. And, this is, when you have general education, it's fine, but, people kind of do it as a duty. Oh, these are core courses, I have to get through them, let me just do it. But I think the most adventurous students will combine unlikely faculties. And I always tell students, if you have quantitative and qualitative ability together, you can do essentially anything. You can do any job, you can study any field, you can really capture any reality in the world. And I also say that, doing music and mathematics or physics and philosophy, computer science and literature is not for everybody. It's kind of really difficult. There are a lot of students who say, I just don't have a head for numbers, or I just can't write, that's not my thing. I'm great with numbers. So I tell them, there are other ways. For instance, if you're a literature student and you really can't do mathematics at all, then I say, okay, do the next thing. If you're majoring in literature, minor in economics. Because economics in its current formulation is very mathematical. Okay, even if that's too mathematical for you, take sociology. You're dealing with an archive which is human life, but your methodology is very quantitative. See, the subjects at the university, there are two ways of looking at it. What is their archive and what is their methodology? And again, there are two archives, the natural archive and the human archive. The natural archive is what we call the natural sciences, and the human archive is the humanities and social sciences. Clearly, it's no longer enough to separate them. We have problems like environmental studies and others which are bringing the two together, but traditionally, these are the divisions. So if you take two fields like sociology and anthropology, it's quite fascinating. They have a very similar archive: human life, group behavior. But whilst anthropology's method is much more humanistic, much more narrative, sociology's method currently is much more data-driven, much more statistical. So this is one way a student who is comfortable, who enjoys humanity, can still be introduced to a quantitative method. And that is, I think, the best way of really kind of expanding them. And that's exactly why it's really important to go beyond that. So what we have is, to kind of put it all together in perspective, we had a past where all these disciplines were together, simply because disciplines were not advanced enough. Things were not that developed. Then came a time, primarily around the European Enlightenment in the 18th century, when things were so advanced that you can't just study them together. You can't say, I'm going to be a chemist and a historian at the same time. Things have gone too far. So that's when we started to divide things. That's when sciences, arts, this division started to become important. But in the 21st century, I think we are again back at a time when it's very important, in spite of these incredible specializations, to go for unexpected and surprising combinations. Obviously, I gave the example at Stanford. Some of you might know the work that is done with the MIT Media Lab. It's really interesting, And I think most of all, the biggest elephant in the room now is AI, and we've heard already in the morning sessions that how AI is a kind of a combination of language, psychology, design, science, and engineering. And not just that, what's very important is the nature of jobs and nature of careers are completely changing. The Jeffrey Selinjo, one of the editors of the Chronicle of Higher Education in the US, says something very interesting, that our working lives are shifting to the right. We are starting late, we are finishing late. Because of medical science and other forms, our retirement and everything is getting pushed back, but we're also starting much later. And this is already true of the industrially developed nations, and I think it's also getting increasingly true of the middle class and above in India. So the question is, what is the best use of the 4 years? Again, at Stanford, there was this very interesting experiment called the Open Loop University. So you get 6 years of college, but you can split it up. You can use 2 years from 18 to 20, use 2 years in your 30s, and then use 2 years in your 60s. You can do it anytime. There's a kind of an experiment. I think it's a bit too radical, because I think because of many reasons, neurological, growth, biological, social, economic, the years between 18 and 22 is the best time when we are ready to learn. But I think the question is, what skills and jobs are important? Obviously our parents often stayed with the same company all their life. We are changing institutions, and I think the new generation are changing, careers. It's all known. And I think what skills? We've already seen that a time where I was just talking at somebody that handwriting is a skill which was very important when, we were in school. Now the question is it really important? And personally, my handwriting is terrible. How much often do we write by hand? Calculators are being allowed. And the biggest question is, of course, AI, which is the elephant in the room. And I read this really interesting article by someone called Suvrat Arora, that one of the things, AI, there's this image capturing AI tool called Mid-Journey, and it's quite fascinating and horrifying to know that what kind of racial biases are there in AI. For instance, whenever, say, a poor person is always known as a black person. An Indian person is an old bearded person, and Amazon's AI-based hiring service sort of showed a bias against women, and they had to be kind of left out. And in the same way, Chicago, there's this whole discrimination of housing loan against black neighborhoods in Chicago based on algorithms. When you ask ChatGPT the image of a scientist, it's always white and male. So what is happening, the whole idea of responsible AI is how to sort of get these algorithms out of existing biases. So clearly this is exactly the kind of thing where the word liberal, and I mean liberal in the fullest sense, because what I've noticed I was talking to one of the delegates just now about what in Asia, what we've seen is many governments are trying to integrate that liberal in a disciplinary sense. Let's do something computer science and literature, but they're not tolerant of the liberal in a political sense. You cannot create smart interdisciplinary graduates and expect them to comply and not kind of accept established judgments. And that is the contradiction which I think a lot of governments in Asia are dealing with, including India. Even the NEP, with which I did some work myself, has this kind of desire to be liberal in a broad way, and yet I think the culture of dissent in our universities are not being tolerated. So this contradiction is something we need to kind of deal with. So finally, I'll just, sum it up by saying that, in many ways, it's just kind of what I'm trying to get to that. What you need is a capacious general education, which I call a T-shaped education, and a contradisciplinary mode of education. Education which makes space for production of knowledge as well, not just the consumption of knowledge. Of course, we never stop consuming knowledge. Even when we are writing books and articles, we are still consuming knowledge, but we must make our students consume knowledge. For instance, in a course I teach, any course I teach at Ashoka, I might have a midterm exam. I might give them an essay prompt. But for the end of the term, I'll say there's no question. You form your own question. You come up with your own question, you answer it. Essentially, a kind of a version of what we ask our PhD students to do. come up with a problem. And I think it's not just in literature, and mathematician friends tell me that there are billions of equations to be solved. The question is not how well you solve an equation, but choose which equation is worth solving. So the questions are often more important. So when you shift the onus of the question to the student, rather than giving them a question, you're actually involving them in the production of knowledge. You're getting them involved in research. And honestly, the product of it doesn't matter. We are not looking for professional research. It's the experience of it. Even if somebody will not have in that subject 10 years from now on, that experience that they actually had their own question will never leave them. That's why it's very important to have production as part of it. And then, of course, all other things which we all know, internships and co-op programs, a mix of classroom instruction, and ideally this should be a 4-year education. And what is most interesting is I speak to a lot of schools, around the country and places, and I meet these contradisciplinarians. I call them contradisciplinarians everywhere. I meet engineers who love music. I meet doctors who love history, all these people. I want to study medicine, but I have this thing. Unfortunately, we've had for the longest time an education system which made you choose. I think the best thing about interdisciplinary liberal arts education is that not only does it not make you choose, not only does it allow you to explore different things, it actually even requires you to. So if you are doing literature, take some math courses. If you are doing math, take some philosophy courses. And this is something that'll, actually it's nothing unnatural. This is who we all are. If we go back and look into ourselves, we are all contradisciplinary personalities. And I think this is what will hold us. And this is going to be the most exciting version of education in the 21st century. Thank you. I think I have a few minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to try to answer them. Yes. No, I was not involved with the school education at all. I was just a consultant for the liberal arts education for the college. So, I mean, I'm not really an expert on K-12 education. There are other people who are looking into that. But I think the idea was, we had several discussions about, is there an Indian component to the liberal arts? Like the word kala, I think came up in our discussions many times. And kala is a very interesting word because kala literally means the art. And yet, it really, if you go and look up, there are 64 versions. Anything from poetry to hairdressing is part of kala. So it's an expansive idea. So I think the idea was that, in the 4-year level, that's why we pushed for a 4-year model, that this is the best way. And I think there's a lot of attempt to also integrate research into it. But of course, policy, this is a very small role I played. I was not part of the committee, but I just had a few sessions with them where I explained what are the possibilities. Because of this book, I got involved. And I think the NEP really does make an attempt. I have a lot of problems with many other aspects of it. I think one of the big problems is how it presents a very singular history of Indian education. It seems like there's only one culture, one religion that has become dominant. So those are things I have some difficulties with. But I do think that it does make for the first time an attempt to depart from this colonial model of single subject education that we've taken for granted for the longest time. And I think there are options, possibilities there. There are a lot of lectures, a lot of institutes are holding this holistic liberal education, education as part of the NEP, and I'm giving several of the talks I've been giving around the country. But I think this is a kind of a possibility of a new departure. Thank you. There was one hand there, yeah.
Or require a lot of funding. Do you think each higher education institution is capable of production of knowledge? They may have the intent for it, but access to resources is very limited.
Yes, that's a really important point. In fact, when I first started writing about it, I used to use the Apple versus Windows analogy. I used to say, liberal education in India is still kind of an Apple project. At the time, Apple, you couldn't really find Apple computer. This was in 2009 and 10. You only had PCs. So I had an Apple. And it's still like an Apple model. And I think we heard in the morning that oft-quoted example of Steve Jobs dropping out of Reed College and saying that those calligraphy classes are what really made me think of the Macintosh fonts. And I think that's true to a great degree even today. It's still a kind of an Apple model of education. And the biggest reason behind it is the kind of resources it requires. The most important thing, a liberal arts classroom requires a certain kind of pedagogy. A certain kind of pedagogy. Like when I'm teaching, say a literature class to a whole room full of people who are engineers, who are not engineers, we don't have engineers, but scientists, economists, other. And my goal is this is the last literature class they're going to take. What do I want them to take away from it? They're not going to remember which poets wrote in the 18th century or 17th century. They're not going to remember any of that. But if I can show them how literature thinks, for instance, this thing called the author function. The idea of the original author didn't exist before the 18th century, before capitalism, before printing, before intellectual property right. Shakespeare didn't know he was a genius. Milton didn't know. They were all stealing plots from everywhere. They were all taking ideas from all over the place. And they were saying Shakespeare is the most sophisticated plagiarist we've known, as you know, but he's a beautiful one. So the point is how the author function emerges in the 18th century as part of printing, as part of capitalism. And if they understand that, they will understand why in the 21st century, again, it's facing a crisis. Performative media, video technology, interactive media, digital art, even that same kind of author function. So my goal is then to understand certain fundamental patterns in literature, not factual details. Of course, you cannot give patterns without the factual details. John Dewey has this wonderful comment that, all these subjects are like vessels. Education is essentially giving you critical thinking, reasoning, which is a fluid. But you cannot offer a fluid without a vessel. So psychology is a certain vessel. Physics is another vessel. They are vessels of different shapes. But essentially, they're giving you the same thing. And unless you're going to be an academic, who specializes in this field, for everybody else, it's the thinking that they're going to take away. Even as you know, in corporate life, people rarely, once they become administrators and managers, they're not dealing with any specific engineering skills. And that is the beauty of liberal thinking. So the challenge is, this kind of teaching is best done in a small classroom setting. It is actually quite difficult. So one of the biggest challenges of liberal education is that you cannot have very large classrooms. It's sometimes possible, like I teach a large lecture class with 100 students with a microphone. We have teaching fellows who lead small discussion sections, but there are logistical problems. Can I read the writing of 100 students? No, it's not possible. So my teaching fellows will do the grading. But when I have a small class, 15 students, then I can do it. So I think this is actually a challenge. I mean, one of the people who endorsed this book was Shashi Tharoor, and he made this very interesting comment about the book that if this can be democratized, this is the big challenge. We know that we have an exciting mode of education between us, and I think there are interesting instances like Ashoka, like Kriya. We've already started to get the process going, but how large can it be? That is still a big question, and sometimes we know that we can never be large. If you look at the Ivy Leagues in the US, they educate probably 3 or 4% of the population. Their influence, on the other hand, is disproportionately huge. Not just because of the people they train, but the research they produce. There are a lot of ethical dilemma about it. Should we have a two-tier system? We are a country of Nehruvian socialism, where there was a socialist equality. Now we have private universities with disproportionate resources. Should we? And this is also something I've seen. I've taught in Canada, which had a more socialist education. The moment I moved to Stanford, I was stunned by the sheer amount of resources one can gather. I think you see that in this school itself. Look at the campus. Look at the resources. And I've heard and I've told that there are only 750 students in the school. So clearly research versus individual allocation is the principle. And that is where liberal arts education is still resource intensive. So it's an ongoing thing. I think we can explore it in many different ways. There are many vernacular ways of exploring liberal arts. And India always had amazing teachers. We've had amazing individuals. I think we had a very indifferent and shaky system mechanical system, but within that mechanical system, we had charismatic teachers. So there's a lot of possibility, but I think we need to, I think right now we are still small. We still need to get this small model perfected. But I think once that is done, I think there's a way in which we can expand slowly. So that's a very important question to think about. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
It's very rigid. And what does this rigidity take us away from? Like, what is this thing that this rigidity takes us away from the liberal education, and what does it not offer to the students? The second one being, while building a T-shaped student, what is there a risk of overgeneralization, which leads to a lot of mediocrity in a lot of things and nothing special? So is there a risk of that?
Very, very important questions. So the first question, you see, I am actually personally in favor of decentralizing education. I'm not a huge fan of central systems. You cannot have central. I think every institution should be allowed to choose its own method. There should be some maybe very loose guidelines. I prefer a federal structure. I was trained in the US. I really believe in that. Like at Ashoka, we come up with very general guidelines for a major, and then individual classes, there's no syllabus. The professor chooses whatever they want to teach. In fact, the professor often teaches something they're researching on. It's very close to. And that creates the most exciting classes. Now for that, you need a research intensive faculty. You cannot, only the faculty who's actually producing research actively can design courses like this. Otherwise, it's much easier to do the safer thing. Get a syllabus, establish syllabus, something that has been honored for decades, let's just go on teaching that. But this pressure to research is also very complicated because it can also be a bureaucratic thing, and there are a lot of editorial journals coming up, which are this point system, so it's not easily done. And I think it's really important to have a strong research foundation, because the research is what produces the future academics. The future, if this quality of PhD starts to drop, which I worry is already happening, the quality of PhD in India is extremely uneven. There's some very poorly produced dissertations which shouldn't have been awarded PhDs, I feel. But once it drops, apart from the knowledge, think of these are the people who are going into the classrooms, and they are training future generation of teachers. So it's a vicious cycle. So I think it's really important to strengthen research. The second question, yes, you're right. And that's exactly, I reminded you, the I is not being replaced by just a vertical. It's a T. If you look at the T, the vertical axis is still longer. So there is depth. We must have depth. So even in a liberal arts model, you choose a major. You cannot just study a range. But, widen the range and make things sexy. Mess things up. Why just study physics with mathematics? Why not physics with philosophy? Why study economics and then math? Why not economics and film studies? And those are the options. So notice, it is not a jack of all trade. This is simply, we are still specialists. Specialists to think differently. Specialists to think outside the box. Okay.
So,
yes?
So we have imbibed a type of education system within us. And if we see humans, we have innate mental structures developed, like Immanuel Kant says as well. So is there a possibility to unlearn for us? If yes, where do we start? What is the fundamental component to begin unlearning?
That's a very complicated question. I think that's why, we who talk about university education, college education, eventually have to look to the school educators, right? We get them when it's too late, in a way. They're 18, and beyond. So the real work is actually being done in schools. And I'm very happy that I can say this in a school, because that's when it starts. And, I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I've seen them grow. And children don't come with anything. Children are literally a blank page. So there's a lot of options right there. So I think, and of course, as we all know, that the real education for children actually happens at home. So this is where I don't want to veer into cliches in areas I don't know, but I think the foundation has to happen much earlier. And even simple things like reading habits, the deadliest thing is screen addiction, those are things which we can remove. And then I think children will surprise you, and everybody knows. I think, again, while working with the NEP, I met this philosopher, forgetting his name right now, but he has this group called Barefoot Philosophers, and he has this wonderful book called Philosophy for Children. And it's really the basic questions children ask. Children ask the most philosophical questions, right? Why are we here? Where are we born? What is the sun? And all kinds of basic questions which can have profound philosophical answers. We dismiss them. So I think this is something that has to happen early on. And then, I think it's extremely complicated. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the CBSE mode of education. I think it really sort of suppresses creativity. It makes you sort of in boxes. But at the same time, I realize CBSE is a model that works for the nation as a whole. We can talk of IB and all those things, but they are still very elite. They're still very elite. So when you dismiss something like CBSE, you have to be careful that, okay, this may work for this, elite family from Delhi or Bombay, South Delhi, South Bombay, but from a really provincial, small town, first generation kid, that CBSE might still be serving their purpose. So it's a very complicated question about access and equity. Obviously, we want an education system, we want to create institutions which are intellectually exclusive but socially inclusive. And that is the balance, that is the paradox that we have to achieve. So yeah, that's a very important question to keep thinking about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I thank you all very much for letting me think along and sort of talk along, and I'll look forward to continuing the conversations with you. Yes, do you have one question? Yeah, sure.
So you proposed a lot of innovative ideas in your lecture, and even in the NEP, a lot of new novel things that we all wish were there when we were kids are proposed. But the reality is, even now as teachers, we are teaching children the same textbooks that we learned. The sort of revolutionary ideas you are proposing in some elite universities that may be implemented. But much of the higher education institutions, that is not happening, and it may not happen. I myself had to spend 8 years of my life to get 2 degrees. But otherwise, I could have majored in 2 degrees in 4 years in a major university. So the question is, will these discussions about liberal arts, about new innovative teaching techniques, will it just stick to some elite circles, or can it really be universally implemented?
See, it's very hard to tell what governments really want. As I said, with Asian governments, what we see I was talking to a colleague from Singapore, that what we saw in Singapore, they wanted this liberal education, they brought Yale into it, Yale NUS was formed, but they couldn't take dissent. So it kind of disintegrated in this paradox. I think a lot of that is also true in India. There's one, like Ashoka was set up not by humanists or educationists, it was set up by entrepreneurs, investors, investment bankers, digital entrepreneurs. And they were saying that, we are not getting good employees. We are really tired of employing these third-rate engineers. We want people who can speak well, who can communicate, we can think differently. Let's set up a liberal arts university. And Ashoka came into being out of that. So there is that desire, but I think the main problem right now in our country is that we are not actually ready for liberal thought. The word liberal in many circles is still a curse word. I don't want to give various versions of that word, which all of you know. If you're on Twitter, you keep hearing that all the time. And I often write articles on this subject, so I'm sometimes caught up in these debates. But clearly, you cannot expect a person who can do computer science and philosophy and not question established opinion and not question power. That is exactly what we teach them. We have to question power. But that is something for which I worry our current powers don't have a stomach for. And that is why you're facing this hypocrisy. On some level, there's this desire, this new India, new economy, new workforce, let's create a workforce which can actually catch up. But no, they will be critical enough to be a good CEO, but not critical enough to question power. That is the hypocrisy we are dealing with. You can't stop it halfway. You have to. In fact, this is exactly what we teach our students. Question us. My classes are interactive. I lecture a little bit, I question. Some of my best students are always pushing me, and I do better when I'm pushed. That is the culture we are fostering in the classroom. So when they leave the classroom and you're going to accept power, how is that possible? Corporate companies sometimes complain to us, oh, your students are amazing, but they're kind of indisciplined. They don't listen. Their complaints against our female students, oh, you're women, you're creating all these feminists. How are they going to live with corporate power structures? I'm like, that's exactly what we want them to. We want them to go to the corporate power and change it. We don't want them to take sort of instructions like, oh, yes, boss, so boss. But that is the problem we are still dealing with. In spite of creating this incredible crop of employees and they're getting 100% employment, I still, even in social circles, I keep hearing, oh, they don't take orders. They don't take instructions. And these women, how are we going to deal with them? Because majority of these corporate leaders are still men. And they have a much harder time facing a young woman who is not willing to just take instructions lying down. And that is something, I think if we have political will, everything is possible. But I don't know if we have political will. That is a bigger question. That's exactly why I'm still working in these niches, these private niches. At least we have an OSS. We are not dependent on government. We are not dependent on... But no country can educate its people by private institutions. It's impossible. Amartya Sen has said that many times. Public universities are the ones which do the real job. And for public universities, we need the government. And we had a wonderful landscape of Nehruvian higher education. I went to St. Xavier's College, Calcutta. I think I paid 20 rupees per month. I essentially got an excellent education for free. But, what is happening to that? What is happening to our public universities? They are being destroyed. So I think that is the big worry, and that is what you're dealing with. Sorry, I'm going on that rant, but thank you all for letting me think about and ramble along, and we'll continue the talk.